I am Karen Hofstetter, and I'm the manager at Redland Community Library. Welcome to the second of our 3 Zoom into History talks this fall. Zoom into History is a collaboration of Redland Library, All Vets of York, and Northeastern York County History and Preservation, commonly known as NECHIP. While both the library and NECHIP organizers plan successful in-person programs, we can't do that right now with the precautions needed to keep individuals safe. So we are working together to present quality virtual programs. So please use the chat if you wish to ask questions, as attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. We will share your questions and comments afterwards and when we open up for the Q&A. Charles Stamball, founder and president of NECHIP, will introduce our topic and presenter this evening.
Greg is a lifelong resident of the city of York and is a third-generation firefighter for the city of York. His grandfather was a volunteer firefighter for the Rescue Fire Company. Greg and his father and his 3 brothers all served as career firefighters for the city of York. Greg retired in 2015 after 34 years of career, and he reached the rank of deputy chief. He was named chief historian of the fire department upon his retirement. With a long life interest in local history, he serves with several historical organizations in the York area. So let's all welcome Greg.
Just a little background on this, and thank you, Charles, for asking me to participate in this. I am a member of a group called the Old Fire Farts of York County, Pennsylvania. It's a group of active and retired firefighters that have a passion for the history of the fire service. It started out as a breakfast group many years ago, and we've since become organized, become a 501c3 organization, and we do some few activities through the year. Last February, we hosted a group called the Society for the Preservation and Appreciation of Antique Motorized Fire Apparatus in America. That's the long official name. Long story short, it's a group of folks that collect antique fire apparatus. So we hosted them here in York in February, and I was asked to give some presentations during that conference. This presentation is as a result of that conference. They just got to look at me as I was talking. Since Charles had asked me to make a presentation here, I threw together a PowerPoint presentation so you could look at something other than my face. Just so you know, in 1921, there weren't a whole lot of people walking around carrying cameras, but there are a few historic photographs in here, and you'll see a lot of newspaper clippings that was part of the research when I started researching this presentation last year. So with that being said, I guess we'll get started. So I've come here this evening to transport you back in time 100 years to 1921 and discuss the status of fire protection in York County. The United States was still recovering from the war to end all wars and was trying to adapt to living in peace. The downturn from the end of the war and all the soldiers returning to the workforce resulted in the Depression of 1920, which would last until July of 1921. The Roaring Twenties would begin in August. The 18th Amendment had passed in 1919, and the country went dry in 1920. Prohibition had become a way of life. But our interest this evening is more local to that of York County. And you'll see the map here on your screens. York County is about 911 square miles in area. It's broken down into 72 local municipalities. One city, which is York, which is shown on the map in yellow, as it was in 1921. It has expanded since then. 36 boroughs, which are shown on the map in light blue, and then 35 townships, which are shown on the map as white areas. Each of the little red dots is where there was a fire station in 1921. So you will note that there were vast portions of the county that did not have a fire station close by. Organized fire protection in York County can be traced back 250 years with the formation of the Sun Fire Brigade of Yorktown in January of 1771. That organization still exists today, now known as the Laurel Fire Company in York City. In 1921, there were 39 fire companies in York County, 6 engine companies and a hook and ladder company in York City, and 27 fire companies in the various boroughs throughout the county, and 5 fire companies located within urban areas of 4 different townships. A number of boroughs and most of the rural areas of the county were without any organized fire protection. The year 1921 opened on January 1st with the dedication of the new engine house in Amicksville, an unincorporated village in Manchester Township. Several hundred firemen from throughout the county traveled to the village to take part in the festivities. The engine house would provide a good first home for the Alert Fire Company's 1919 Oban Chain Boyer chemical fire apparatus. And let me preface that you're going to hear me referring a lot to details on the fire apparatus, and that's because I did this for that fire apparatus collectors group originally. The firemen paraded through the village with their chemical apparatus in the procession, and after the festivities, a meal was served in the basement of the Amicksville Band Hall. On January 4th, the Victory Fire Company in Spring Garden Township elected their first regular slate of officers, and the Community Fire Company of Seven Valleys elected temporary officers. The Victory Fire Company had just chartered in 1920, and the Community Fire Company of Seven Valleys had applied for their charter in January of 1921. So these were 2 very young fire companies at the time. The entire city fire department had been motorized by 1921, although a few of the horse-drawn apparatus still remained in the back of some of the engine houses. Throughout the county, there were still hand-drawn rigs serving many of the smaller boroughs. The borough of Lewisberry in northern York County had a piece of fire apparatus, even though they did not yet have an organized volunteer fire company. Other fire apparatus happening throughout the county. In York, the city was struggling to find someone to repair the Vigilant steamer. The steamer had been motorized in 1915, having been placed on a chassis by the Morton Truck Company of Harrisburg. A problem with the boiler kept the apparatus out of service for several months, and this is actually a pretty rare photo of that piece of apparatus working in a fire. On February 8th, the Wrightsville Steam Fire Engine Company No. 1 appointed a committee to establish a set of rules for the running of their new fire engine. Too many firemen were jumping onto the rig when responding to a fire, causing the rig to stall out going up some of the steep grades in Wrightsville Borough. The rig was a 1920 Ford Howell pumper, and this is their old fire station. The Delta Volunteer Fire Company was exploring the purchase of a motorized chemical fire apparatus. After a trip to Baltimore, the committee suggested that a chassis be purchased and the hand-drawn chemical apparatus be mounted on it. They eventually opted to purchase an international chassis and also purchased a child chemical apparatus with 2 35-gallon tanks, which they mounted on the chassis. The chemical apparatus, which you'll hear me talk about a lot through this, they were tanks that held water with a sodium bicarbonate solution in them. And when they got to a fire, they would dump a charge of acid into that mixture. And for those of you that remember chemistry class in school, when you mixed acid and baking soda, what you get is a production of carbon dioxide gas. So when they did that inside of a tank, it pressurized the tank, and then that pressure would push the solution through a hose. And it was a way for them to quickly put water on a fire without firing up a boiler to do so. It became a very important firefighting tool in the late 1800s into the early 1900s because it was a very quick way to get water onto a fire. Essentially, it was a big fire extinguisher mounted on a truck. In July, the Eureka Fire Company in Stewartstown received their new high-wheeled hose cart. An order of new hose for the hose cart had previously arrived in the borough, and the firemen felt this would be easier to pull to fires than the old hose cart. So this was in 1921. Stewartstown was still purchasing a hand-drawn piece of fire apparatus to serve in the borough. At an August 15th meeting of the Glen Rock Hose and Ladder Company, it was decided to purchase a combination pumper. The firemen began to raise money to purchase the rig, and at a special meeting on October 28th, they approved the purchase of an American LaFrance 750 GPM pumper. That was actually a pretty state-of-the-art vehicle for Glen Rock. Also in August, the Eagle Fire Company of Mount Wolf appointed an apparatus committee. It was not initially decided if the new apparatus would be motorized or hand-drawn, and at their October 15th meeting, they authorized the purchase of a waterless triple combination pumper for $3,500 mounted on a Ford chassis, and that pumper was delivered on November the 10th. On September 5th, the Union Fire Company of Manchester took delivery of their new Belmont Motor Company chemical truck. The new rig was housed during the county convention in September and a dedication in a ceremony on Thanksgiving Day. They had planned to do a parade on that day as well, but Thanksgiving Day brought heavy rains to Manchester, so they canceled the parade. On November 14th, the Community Fire Company of Seven Valleys, which is one of our baby companies we talked about in the very beginning, they opted to purchase a motor fire apparatus, and a representative of the Waterous Fire Engine Company was at the meeting. On December 14th, the Community Fire Company of York Anna ordered a pumper from American LaFrance, and this is a photo I found of it that was done quite a few years later with some of their newer apparatus also posed by it. Representatives from fire companies from outside the county visited several fire companies to inspect their apparatus. Harrisburg Mayor George Hoverter and some of his staff visited York on February 28th to inspect York's apparatus. Representatives from Chambersburg visited York on April 13th to examine York's apparatus, as they were considering the purchase of new apparatus for their department. So when you bought fire trucks back then, it wasn't like you could go to the fire truck lot and look them over. So if you wanted to get an idea of what the different manufacturers were building, you had to find someone in your area that had a piece of apparatus from that manufacturer. On December 1st, representatives from Paradise and Lehman Place fire companies in Lancaster County visited Mount Wolf to look at their new apparatus. Both companies vowed to buy similar apparatus for their fire companies when they returned to Lancaster. And conversely, on March 7th, Fire Chief George Crawl, that was George S. Crawl, who was the grandfather of George E. Crawl, who would become fire chief in 1976. George S. Crawl and York City staff members visited Chester, Pennsylvania to examine their city service ladder truck, as they were considering one for the Rex Hook and Ladder Company. And they did end up buying one for the Rex in 1926, I believe. In most of the boroughs, the engine house also served as a municipal building. Borough council meetings were held in the engine houses, and many groups such as the Boy Scouts, the Campfire Girls, fraternal organizations, all met in the meeting rooms of the firehouses. Many of the engine houses also served as polling places. There were, however, some other creative uses for the firehouse, some of which worked as fundraisers for the fire company. In Glen Rock, the fire company voted to allow the school district to rent a room on the third floor of the engine house for $20 per month to be used as a school classroom. This would allow the school district to expand the high school program from a 2-year program to a 3-year program. The room in the engine house would be used for a primary school class, and then their former classroom would be used for the high school. In Delta, fire company used the engine house as a movie theater, which provided a reliable revenue stream for the fire company. The fire company was able to pay off the debt on their engine house and begin to save money for the purchase of fire apparatus just by showing movies at the firehouse. In Red Lion and in Wrightsville, baby clinics were held monthly in the engine houses. Doctors and nurses were available to examine children to check for any maladies. The clinics were set up by the State Department of Health to reduce childhood deaths, especially amongst rural children. Some of the fire companies made renovations to their engine houses in 1921. In several cases, this required planning to provide for the housing of their apparatus. What you see here is the old Leo Fire Company building on First Avenue in Red Lion. In Red Lion, the Leo Fire Company contracted with Watt and Brother of York for papering and frescoing the interior of the engine house. While the work was being done, the steamer and the chemical wagon were housed in the basement of the Peter McGuigan cigar factory. The hose and ladder wagon and the hose carriage were stored at the A.H. Uffelman building, while the motorized fire engine remained in the engine house. So while all that was going on, they had apparatus in 3 different places. So when they had a fire, I guess they had to coordinate who was going which direction to get which piece of apparatus. In North York, the paving of North George Street in front of the Liberty Engine House required the relocation of their fire apparatus. The apparatus was housed in the garage of the Chief Burgess of the borough, Harry G. Rohrbach. And for those who don't know, Chief Burgess was an early name for mayor in our area. The Victory Fire Company secured a lot on Mount Rose Avenue for them to erect their engine house. And we have an image here when it was completed in 1922. This one is interesting. There's 3 different firehouses in the York area with a very similar design, this being one of them. And there's also one in Harrisburg. Myself and the historian from Harrisburg have been trying to dig into it to find out why 3 different firehouses in York and one in Harrisburg were all built to a very similar design. Still looking for the answers on that. In New Freedom, the Rose Fire Company entered into an agreement with the borough to rent the former powerhouse building at a cost of $12 per year with a rental agreement of 24 years. The fire company decided to add a 2nd story to the building and to erect a hose tower prior to occupying the building. The fire company would auction off their old engine house and another property owned by the fire company and planned to purchase modern motorized fire apparatus once they moved to the new engine house. And this carried on all through the rest of 1921 and into 1922. Occasionally there'd be mentions in the paper of steel beams showing up to be part of the renovations. So it was quite a project for a fire company to tackle at that time. In West York, the Reliance firemen were discussing the expansion of their engine house and requested that the borough erect an annex to the rear of the engine house. The borough council told them to have plans drawn and submitted to the state for approval and then submit them to the borough council for consideration. I found that one kind of interesting, is that they wanted the fire company to jump through all those hoops, get all those approvals done, and then come back to the borough, and all the borough would have to do is say, we don't have the money for that. So it was kind of interesting. And politics haven't changed much in 100 years. Issues involving the public interfering with the fire service also came to a head in 1921. In Harrisburg on February the 1st, the House passed a bill making it a misdemeanor to send in a false fire alarm or to tamper with a fire alarm. Act number 88 became law in May of 1921 and was punishable by a fine of not more than $500 or imprisonment of not more than 2 years. This bill was introduced by Representative Pike, which prohibited motorists from racing fire apparatus and from parking within 1,000 feet of any fire. Also in May, Governor Sproul signed the Dakes bill, which allowed cities to regulate or prohibit the sale and use of fireworks. Be good if we had that one today. On July 22nd, York's Mayor E.S. Huggentugler ordered the police department to make, quote, wholesale arrests of motorists who interfered with fire apparatus. At several recent fires, apparatus were being followed by long trails of automobiles who then parked their vehicles near the fire scenes, causing traffic congestion and hampering access for more apparatus. Citations would be issued under the regulations of the Pike bill that was passed earlier. On December 16th, Ralph Detweiler of York drove his automobile over a fire hose at a fire in York on Newberry Street. Detweiler appeared before Mayor Huggentugler in police court the next afternoon, where he was ordered to pay a $10 fine or spend 10 days in jail. He opted to pay the $10 fine. On December 22nd, Charles Jackson, who was 18 years old, was charged by the police with disorderly conduct for interfering with and criticizing firemen at the scene of a fire. He appeared before Mayor Huggentugler in police court the next afternoon, and the mayor discharged him with a reprimand. So earlier we had talked about the County Firemen's Convention in Manchester. The 8th annual convention of the Firemen's Association of York County was hosted by the Union Fire Company of Manchester on Labor Day, Monday, September 5th. The business session opened promptly at 10 a.m. and a parade through Manchester was the highlight of the afternoon. Excuse me. 9 county fire companies and all of the city's fire companies participated in the parade, along with 10 bands. That evening, a reception was held at Cold Springs Park, which included a corn soup dinner and dancing, and about 1,000 firemen participated in the parade. Of course, the firemen, much like they do today, had to hold fundraising events to raise money for their fire companies. In addition to the usual picnics, bazaars, smokers, dances, etc., a few fundraisers seem to be a bit unique. In North York, the Liberty Fire Company had a community dinner. That in itself was not unusual. What was unusual is that they didn't know specifically what they were going to serve. The firemen solicited every home in the borough, and some of those just beyond the borough limits where Liberty would respond in case of a fire. The residents were asked to donate any food items that could be used to make a soup or other delicacies. After collecting a massive amount of food, the ladies' auxiliary set to work making soups, sweets, and other items from the donated food. This was the first dinner to be held since the war and was a rousing success. When you read some of the other newspaper articles about this, it talked about how full the firehouse was with all the food that was donated by the different residents. In the city, the Eagle Fire Company desired to hold a carnival beginning April 9th. Applying to the city for a license to hold the carnival, the mayor's clerk refused to issue a license on orders from Mayor Huggentugler. The mayor and the district attorney had reservations about gambling devices and other activities that they believed occurred at carnivals. Believing city officials that they would issue a permit, the Eagle had already spent $300 on the carnival, contracting with United American Shows and printing advertisements for the carnival. Feeling backed into a corner, the fire company secured attorneys to determine their course of action. They first appealed to the entire license board and prepared to take the city to court. However, the firemen found another unique solution. As the engine house is on the south end of the city, not far from the city border, a suitable location was found outside of the city, but only a few hundred feet west of the engine house. Being in Spring Garden Township, the carnival did not require a license from the city. At their meeting on April 5th, the Eagle firemen passed an interesting resolution which read as follows. Resolved that the action of the mayor in protecting the city of York be commended, and that the Eagle Hose and Chemical Company No. 7 goes on record as being in favor of any action for the uplift of the morals of our city, and be it further resolved that we trust that the officials will continue in their vigilance and give us a clean city. I think it was a little poke here more than anything else. One can only assume that this was a thumbing of the nose to the mayor. It was reported that the mayor got a good laugh from the resolution, and the week-long carnival was held with relatively few issues. The fire companies, of course, amongst all these other events, had fires to fight, and here are some of the more notable fires in 1921. On January 13th at about 8:15 p.m., fire was discovered on the roof of a residence in Railroad Borough. A bucket brigade was hastily formed and help was requested from New Freedom, Glen Rock, and Shrewsbury. By the time firemen arrived, the building was fully involved. Firemen concentrated their efforts on preventing the fire from spreading to other nearby buildings. The building was the former Jones Mill barn, which had been converted into 4 apartments. At 3:45 a.m. on February the 12th, fire was discovered in the tool house of the Delta Electric Light and Power Company. The fire extended to the transformer house, destroying both buildings and throwing the borough into darkness. The borough of Delta was without electricity until March 5th, when the plant was back online. Can you imagine being without power for more than 3 weeks today? On April 15th at about 4 p.m., a fire was discovered in a 2-story garage and stable in Red Lion. The building and the 2 wagons stored inside were a total loss. This was the first fire for the Leo Fire Company's new motorized engine, a 1920 American LaFrance triple combination pumper. On May the 12th at about 4 p.m., fire was discovered in the storage building at the American Phosphorus Company plant in Cly, a small village in northern York County. The concrete storeroom, about 12 feet by 26 feet, contained about $10,000 worth of finished product. The storeroom contained finished product that was imported from France, and it was believed that some of this foreign product had spontaneously combusted. The Cly plant was the only American-owned plant in the country that made phosphorus. A foreign-owned plant operated in New York State. The only way to extinguish the fire was to completely submerge the product in water. The 15,000 gallons of firefighting water at the plant was exhausted early. Firemen from York Haven and Goldsboro were summoned, but could do little to combat the fire. The image of the plant's actually a postcard I have in my collection. My family has a connection to Cly, so I'm always interested in Cly stuff. On Saturday evening, May 28th, a thunderstorm passed through the York area. Lightning struck a residence at 822 South George Street in York City. A 13-year-old girl sleeping on the second floor heard the crackling of flames and alerted her mother, who investigated and found a fire on the third floor. Chemical apparatus responded and attempted to extinguish the fire. Fire Chief George Kroll, seeing that the chemical crews were unable to extinguish the fire, sounded Gamewell box number 128 at George Street and Springersbury Avenue, bringing out the entire first alarm assignment. While fighting the fire, 2 members of the Laurel Fire Company were overcome by escaping gas. One was revived at the scene, while the other was transported to York Hospital for treatment. On June 22nd at about 3:30 p.m., fire was discovered in the main central garage in Manchester, Maryland. The fire quickly spread to adjoining dwellings and other outbuildings, and the fire spread beyond the capabilities of the Manchester firemen to control it. Firemen from a number of nearby fire companies, including Hanover in southwestern York County, were called to assist. After receiving permission from the acting Burgess to respond, the 2 Hanover companies responded, making the 12-mile trip in 17 minutes. The Hanover firemen were unable to secure a water source and did all their firefighting with chemicals. The fire destroyed 5 dwellings, the brick fireman's hall, an insurance office, the garage, 8 barns, and a number of outbuildings. A bank and 2 other buildings were damaged to the point that they would probably have to be rebuilt. 2 firemen were injured and 7 head of cattle were killed. Damage was estimated at $50,000. A barn a quarter-mile away was believed also to have been ignited by a brand from this fire, destroying it and the livestock inside. The tired Hanover firemen remained on the scene until about 8 p.m. when they were able to return home. On Friday, July 1st, fire was discovered in the foundry at the Reed Machinery Plant in Glen Rock at about 2 a.m. By 2:30 a.m., the fire had destroyed half of the plant and had extended to the Dice and Kohler restaurant and the Newhouse hardware store. A request for help was sent to York, and Mayor Huggentugler sent the Laurel Fire Company apparatus, accompanied by Fire Chief George Kroll. The caravan made it about a mile south of the city when Chief Kroll's car broke down. Kroll abandoned his vehicle and boarded the chemical apparatus. The caravan started again, reaching speeds of 50 miles per hour when conditions allowed it, the highway heading south from York being concrete. Arriving in less than 25 minutes, the Laurel firemen quickly went to work. The mill race was dammed, and the Laurel pumper fed 4 hose lines with water from the race. The Pine Troop of the Girl Scouts in Glen Rock quickly organized to provide support to the firemen. At about 3 a.m., York Mayor Huggentugler arrived in Glen Rock, and upon parking his car, was told by the Girl Scouts to move his vehicle, as he had parked where they were setting up a stand to provide food and drinks to the firemen. The mayor moved his vehicle to accommodate the scouts. The Girl Scouts provided sandwiches and lemonade to the firemen. The Laurel firemen remained in Glen Rock most of the morning, returning to York just before noon. On July 14th at about 4 p.m., fire was discovered on the Huber farm about a mile north of Wrightsville. Wrightsville firemen arrived and found a fire involving wheat that had been harvested from about 6 acres that was stacked next to the barn, which was full of harvested hay and wheat. The call for assistance from York and Columbia, the Laurel and Vigilant fire companies responding from York, and the Susquehanna Fire Company responded from Columbia. Chief Crawl had to once again abandon his vehicle, again riding to the scene with the Laurel firemen. The Vigilant firemen were delayed due to engine trouble but didn't make it to the scene. Firemen pulled the stacks of burning wheat apart by hand, eventually extinguishing the fire. The barn was saved. In August, Miss Huber sent a letter of appreciation to the city, along with a donation of $42.10 for the city fire companies responding to the fire. I have no clue why she came up with that number. On August 8th at 10 a.m., fire was discovered in the basement of the American Toy Desk Company in Glen Rock. The factory was located in an alley to the rear of Hanover Street, and a brisk wind quickly fanned the flames. The fire destroyed the plant and 4 nearby barns and damaged a number of outbuildings. Damage was estimated at $45,000. On the morning of August 22nd, fire destroyed the Fate and Heil slaughterhouse in the village of Nashville. The 24 by 30 foot 2-story building was completely destroyed. The villagers gathered to help as they could, as the town had no fire company or fire apparatus. A request was made to Spring Grove for help, but the building was consumed so quickly and the villagers prevented the fire from spreading, so no help was sent. On October the 1st at about 10 p.m., fire was discovered at the Cooper manufacturing plant about a mile southwest of Hellam along the Pennsylvania Railroad. Calls were sent to Wrightsville and York for assistance. By the time the Vigilant Chemical crew arrived from York, the plant had been destroyed. Later into the incident, the fire chief's car was bringing extra chemical charges to the scene, but they had to abandon the car and carry the supplies in as the roadway had been completely blocked by automobiles and onlookers. At about 1:30 that afternoon, fire was discovered at a summer residence in York-Anna. The York-Anna firemen had their hand-drawn chemical apparatus and were fighting the fire, but it was feared that the fire would extend to other nearby buildings. The Vigilant Chemical crew was once again on the road and arrived and assisted in preventing the fire from spreading. 2 out-of-town mutual aid responses, especially of this distance, was unheard of in 1921. At 12:30 on the morning of October 25th, fire was discovered involving a barn in York-Anna, very near where the fire was on October the 1st. The York-Anna firemen used their chemical apparatus to prevent the fire from spreading, and a call was again sent to York for assistance. The Laurel and Vigilant chemical apparatus responded, along with Fire Chief Crawl, making the run in 28 minutes. Leonard Enright, a Vigilant fireman, received chemical burns to his face while mixing chemicals to refill the chemical tank on the apparatus. The fire was confined to the barn, and the large cigar factory just 40 feet away from the barn was spared. The fire was mysterious in origin. At about 2 a.m. on October 31st, it was obvious that York-Anna had a fire bug. A fire was discovered in an unused tenant house on the Hirsch farm on the York Road about a half mile from York-Anna Borough. The York-Anna firemen once again called York for help, and the Laurel apparatus responded and assisted in fighting the fire. The house was destroyed, but nearby buildings were saved. On December the 8th, shortly after 8 p.m., fire was discovered in the 2-story garage of Clifford Flaherty in Hellam. The fire involved the upper story of the garage, and only one of the 6 automobiles in the garage was damaged. Flaherty had recently moved to Hellam from York-Anna, and he believed that the fire was intentional and connected to the other York-Anna fires. And to finish up our journey back to 1921, I want to share a few more events from that era. An unusual alarm was received about 2 a.m. on the morning of September 22nd at the Vigilant Engine House. On the company blackboard where all alarms of fire are recorded, the following entry was placed. Alarm, 2 a.m., September 22nd, 541 Mackenzie Street. Mary Elizabeth Ziegler, 13 pounds. Elmer Ziegler, who was the driver of the Vigilance hose wagon, was summoned to his home to assist in welcoming his new daughter. On the afternoon of September 21st, members of the Union Fire Company were in their engine house on North George Street, preparing to toll the station's tower bell for the funeral of one of their members. Several boys rushed in from the rain and excitedly told the firemen that there was a bull in the backyard of the engine house. Eugene Welsh, the driver of the chemical engine, walked out into the yard to work, not believing the boys. Welsh was amazed to find that there was indeed a bull in the yard, lunging at the alley fence, trying to get at some other boys who were teasing the bull. Welsh walked down through the yard, attempting to open the alley gate and let the bull out of the yard, when the bull turned, lowered its head, and lunged towards Welsh. The bull quickly closed on Welsh, and it was only due to the rain-covered bricks in the backyard that Welsh wasn't gored. The bull lost its footing on the wet bricks and fell, giving Welsh a chance to escape. Shortly after, cattlemen appeared with 4 other bulls. The bull had apparently become unmanageable as the cattlemen were driving the bulls towards the train station, so they penned the bull in the yard while they drove the rest of the cattle to their destination. They placed the other bulls in the yard, and when the unruly bull allowed the other bulls to calm it down so they could remove him from the yard. I had no concept that in 1921 they were still driving livestock through the streets of downtown York. When I read this, I was totally flabbergasted by that. And finally, a tradition at the Laurel Engine House was to provide some Christmas cheer to the neighborhood. Planning would begin months ahead. For 1921, a large Christmas tree would be placed in the apparatus room of the engine house along the south wall. Under the tree would be an elaborate display, a miniature village with running water and live goldfish, and an exact replica of the engine house, complete with miniature lights and apparatus. The Laurel firemen purchased 750 pounds of candy and several hundred pounds of nuts, planning on having enough on hand to provide a treat on Christmas morning at the engine house for 1,500 children. Unfortunately, the Laurel firemen ran out of gifts before every child had received one. Several thousand people, adults as well as children, got to see the holiday display. And that is the end of our journey back to 1921. I hope you all appreciated it. I definitely enjoyed researching it. I learned things as well, so I hope all of you learned something too.
Wow. I loved it. This was very interesting. And I was curious, Greg, about whether or not anything as far as fires was due to arson. And then you brought in that story about Yorkana, that was it Yorkana that had
Yes.
that had a firebug, and that just baffles me that they had arsonists.
I thought people acted a lot better back then, but when you really dig, they probably didn't act much better than they do today.
Wow. Oh my, lots of interesting stories, and you got all that from the newspapers. That's pretty neat.
Fortunately, I have access to newspapers.com, and that has been a wonderful resource for me.
Tell us a little bit about the Fire Museum.
Oh, the Fire Museum? Sure. The Fire Museum of York County started back in the 60s. Fire Chief Robert Little and some other fire chiefs from throughout the county. Just to back up a little bit, firemen are really good at holding on to stuff. Every fire company has historic artifacts of some kind. So in the 60s, they talked about organizing a fire museum. They organized as an organization, and they didn't have a home. Initially, they had displays set up at the Historical Society on East Market Street. And then in 1981, they leased from the city the second floor of the Royal Engine House at 757 West Market Street. The city was using the first floor, and the Fire Museum used the second floor. Eventually, the city moved the rest of their operations out of the building and allowed the museum to rent the whole building. And then eventually the museum purchased the building from the city. It's a great museum with a very interesting collection of York County Fire Service artifacts. They eventually merged with what was called the York County Heritage Trust at the time. We know it today as the York County History Center. Those of us old enough still refer to it as the Historical Society. It's open on Saturdays, spring through fall. They close down for the winter because of the cost of heat in the whole building. But yeah, if you have any sort of interest in York County Fire Service history, there's some great stuff there. All the way back to hand-drawn apparatus. There's one steamer there. There's a bunch of motorized apparatus and just all sorts of great artifacts to look at there.
I like the one tombstone of a horse that's outside of the museum.
Mac, the noble horse of the Rescue Fire Company.
Right.
Yes, Mac was a long-lived horse. And when they decided to retire him, they didn't want to give him up because they were afraid that he would just die from that. Plus, they were so attached to him and they didn't want to turn him into glue. So they built a special stall in the back of the firehouse for Mac. And he stayed there. And every once in a while, when something happened to one of the other horses, he'd get pulled back into service. So he was there for, I think he was 34 years when he finally had to be put down. He actually appeared in a show in the theater at Highland Park out in West York, where they raised money to provide a burial plot and marker for him. He was originally buried up in Bummy's Woods off of Rafton Road, and that's where he was until Penn State York started to develop that area. And with the Fire Museum organizing and having a home out in West Market Street, they had his remains disinterred, and they reburied him on the lawn of the York County Fire Museum. The one fact that a lot of people don't realize is from the time that he was disinterred until he was reburied, his remains were in the box on the back seat of Art Ryder's car. Art Ryder was the captain of the Rescue Fire Company, which is where Mac had served. So in between time, they had a fire up in the south end of the city, and they're at the fire, and the fire was done, and they were cleaning up. And finally, Art Ryder looked at everybody and said, you know what? Mac made it to one more fire. His remains were in the back of the car, and it was in Mac's first due area. The stuff you can't make up. So Mac went to one more fire long after he was dead.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah.
Someone
Greg,
had told me that he was sold to a milkman to pull the milk wagon for a period of time.
No, Mac wasn't. A lot of the other fire horses, they sold when they became too old to be counted on for fire horses. So yeah, a lot of times they were sold to milkmen or other businessmen that needed horses to pull their wagons to conduct their business. And every once in a blue moon, if the fire trucks ran by while their horses were out, if they weren't properly secured, they would run after the fire trucks to go to a fire because it was so ingrained in their minds. But yeah, Mac was never sold. Mac, they kept until he died.
Okay.
Greg, this is Sherry. Did the city of Hanover have a Dalmatian or any fire dogs at all?
Oh yeah, all the fire companies had dogs. As a matter of fact, we've had, I think, 2 that died at incidents. I think the Rex's dog, and I'm drawing a blank if his name was Rex or if it was something else. They were out on a water rescue out along Richland Avenue into Cador's Creek when he was hit by a car. Yeah, we've had all sorts of animals, lots of Dalmatians, other kinds of dogs, cats, birds. The Royal had an alligator that lived in the lawn out front, unsecured.
Okay.
Yeah, the animals that were mascots through the fire companies through the years, it was quite a menagerie.
Why did they seem to go with Dalmatians as far as?
Dalmatians were coach dogs, particularly over in England. They were bred to, number one, is protect the horse-drawn coaches when the people were away from them. And they got along really well with the horses. So they were a natural when the fire service started using horses because they, by genetic breeding, got along well with the horses. And they did essentially the same task for the firemen. They ran along with the horses. A lot of time they'd be right behind the horses' heels barking, which encouraged the horses to run a little faster. And then once they got to the scene, they would keep an eye over the apparatus to make sure that nobody who wasn't supposed to be with the apparatus would take anything or do anything to the apparatus. And that tradition continued on even into the motorized era. Bob Straw, who is one of our old fire farts, he was a volunteer down at the Union Firehouse on North George Street. And the dog down there, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but if he didn't know you, you could not get near their fire truck. He would sit up top and he would growl and snarl and bare his teeth if he did not know who you were. If he knew you as a Union fireman, you could do whatever you wanted.
When was the last dog that the city had, Greg?
The last dog we had would have been Tiller. Tiller was bought in, I would say sometime around 2000. And he was more doing fire prevention stuff than he was actually running out of the stations. But occasionally he ran out of a few of the stations. He would do stop, drop, and roll and stuff like that for the school programs. And then he got retired, I don't know, maybe 2006 or something like that. The last true mascots before that would have been in the 1960s. The director of public safety banned them around 1965, something like that. I'd have to look through my notes. They had an incident where the dog either nipped at or bit someone, and the city took the loss prevention route and said, that's it, no more dogs. So the ones that were there could stay, but once they passed on, no new ones were allowed.
Are there other fire museums in the county?
Yes, there's actually several. Greater Hanover Fire Museum is in the old Eagle No. 2 engine house down in Hanover. That is a beautiful museum. They put a lot of money into that old firehouse to get it looking like it's brand new. They have a great collection of artifacts. I believe Glen Rock has a small museum at their firehouse, as well as Dallastown.
Manchester?
I think Manchester has some items, but I don't know if they have anything like an actual museum. But I think they do have some artifacts somewhere around the firehouse.
I think they have their original apparatus.
Yes, that's right. They do have their hand-drawn piece. Unfortunately, a lot of their stuff was lost when their old firehouse burned down, the one that was on Main Street. They were in the newer firehouse, but the old one had burned down when the building next door caught on fire and extended into it. And a lot of their old stuff was up in the attic and was lost.
Okay. Well, there were no questions in the chat, and I think anybody who wanted to talk to you may have done it. I'll just wait 1 minute. Is there anyone else that has a question or a comment for Greg?
Greg, are you overseeing the police museum as well?
I'm involved with the police museum. I'm on the board of directors, but I'm not running it or anything like that. I'm just one of the worker bees. I maintain the website, and I was treasurer for quite a few years. But the police museum is still in existence. We're in between homes. Our problem is the kind of home we need, we don't have the money for, and the kind of homes we have the money for doesn't really fit our collection. So we're in the process of trying to do some things. Number one, to get some money back in, and hopefully find a new home for the police museum. Anybody has a big museum building they'd like to donate to us, we'd be more than happy to take it. But yes, the police museum still exists. We still have our website. We're still on Facebook, and we're trying to kind of interact with people more electronically now until we can find a physical home again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, unfortunately, we were in the middle of a redevelopment project, and we knew it was best to sell our building and allow that project to continue on. We wanted to be good stewards of the city, and unfortunately, just things didn't work out, and we had a couple different homes, and none of them ever worked out for what we wanted to be. So we're between homes. The collection is in good storage and being taken care of. We're just trying to hold our own and trying to find a home again.
Okay. All right. I think I am going to wrap up and say thank you, Greg. This was a very, very informative, very enlightening program.
No,
So,
thank you. And thank you everyone for coming.
um,
I enjoy sharing what I can find. And it was great to be able to share this program for a second time rather than use it once and put it on the shelf.
Sure.
I appreciate the opportunity.
So I do want to talk a little bit about our next program. We had a change of topic here. So if you see the slide, we are going to have one more program, and our own Charles Stambaugh, who's here, will bring to life the story of Forest Park, an amusement park that once delighted folks of all ages in Hanover. And I have stories from my own family who enjoyed the roller coaster with the star on top. And I remember even going roller skating there with my brownie troop. So I know the park as well. And so please register at yorklibraries.org events for the next one. It's actually the same login. We made all 3 Zooms have the same login, so it's easier, but I will send them out again as a courtesy. And these programs, just to let you know, they are all recorded and they will be available on York County Library's YouTube channel and on NECHEP's website once it's back edited and back up. Thank you everyone for participating with us this evening. We appreciate your comments. Stay safe and stay connected to your library. Good night, everyone. Good night, Charlie.
Good night. We'll see you next month.
Okay, thank you. Bye.